Go.
I learned something new this morning on how to use a laser pointer, so I'm going to have fun today. All right, standing up a CoE, we're going to talk about environment. And I will tell you, the next two sessions to me are so intimately interrelated that it's hard to break these out separately. And I struggle with this every time I talk about or present on how to stand up a CoE. Do we combine environment and scalability because they are both important to each other, or do we separate them? So this time, again, after my struggle, I decided to do separate. That may change in my future endeavors in this, but decided to do separate this time. We're talking about environment. Environment, I mean, obviously systems, IT, laws, controls, audit, external and internal. And one of the things that I also want to point out is I consider human capital, that's our brains, to be part of organizational systems. And some people may laugh at me and think I'm plumb crazy. And that's one of the things that the human training part and the development of your staff is so critical to the environment, but it's also critical to scalability because you can't scale your CoE without the talent base. So I may say some things today that you may hear me repeat tomorrow if you decide to join tomorrow's. And for that, I apologize before, but keep in mind that it's just because they're so connected. All right, environment. I'm going to skip that, and I will skip that nice little quote I find. All right, let's all put ourselves in the desk chair of someone that is building automations for a publicly traded corporation. And you're not using a citizen developer necessarily, or you may be. You're using unattended automations, and you're RDPing into a remote server or a Citrix server, whatever it might be, to perform your automations. Here's your controls. I don't know how many of you are old enough, as me, to remember Enron and WorldCom. I'm not going to go into details about them, but the fallout from the Enron and WorldCom scandals prompted our legislature to develop what's called Sarbanes-Oxley. It's a law that was passed by both unanimously, I think, even by Congress and the Senate. And this added a very heavy burden on, I can't say financial, but it probably translated to extra costs, burden on accounting teams. And we're going to focus on Sarbanes-Oxley, not because most automations, and most do, start in a financial arena, but because it touches every aspect of an organization, including your RPA CoE. So Sarbanes-Oxley basically means you need to control your controls. Before we had separation of duties. Now you need to control that. So we don't have another we don't have another Enron or WorldCom explosion. So Sarbanes-Oxley says control controls. So what does that mean? That means if you have segregation of duties, you cannot, for example, you as an individual employee doing something manually, you're preparing a journal entry, for example. You cannot validate your own journal entry and then submit your own journal entry. Same way, in some organizations, if you have access to the balance sheet, you don't get access to the income statement. Control your controls. So even with RPA, you cannot, if you're operating with service accounts, you cannot have a service account that prepares a journal entry, then validates that journal entry against the data it was given to populate that journal entry, and then submit that journal entry for submission into an ERP system. It's a no-no. You're using the same service account. And in an organization, service accounts are considered employees. In fact, in my most immediately prior organization to where I'm at now, back when I was with GameStop, in the organizational hierarchy, all of the bots reported to me. because they were considered by the organization to be employees. So I supervised them all. I didn't have to do performance reviews and such. I didn't have to worry about PTO and things, but they were all in the organizational chart reporting directly to me. So controlling controls. Another example, we built an automation that audited your roles in a system. And let me explain that. Sarbanes-Oxley requires that an individual's access into solutions the company uses, whether it's in the finance department, whether it's in your warehouse, your distribution, your supply chain, requires that those roles and that access and those privileges be audited every 3 months. So we built a bot to do that. The problem we had with this is the bot could not validate its own roles. So we had to build in alternatives for that. Control your controls. And if you were on one of my earlier sessions in this arena of centers of excellence, you remember we talked about a steering committee and we talked about players in your process. And I didn't bring this individual up back then because this individual, I wanted to wait till this session to bring this individual into my steering committee, an internal audit representative. Every automation, because if you're in a publicly traded organization, and let me say this, even if you're not in a publicly traded organization, I also worked for a company called, I'll just say I worked for a company called Mary Kay Cosmetics, privately owned, not subjected because they're privately owned corporation to Sarbanes-Oxley, but they followed Sarbanes-Oxley because they were audited from outside auditors. So even if you find yourself in a privately held organization, you may still find that that organization follows Sarbanes-Oxley. So in our original steering committee, you did not see a representative from internal audit. And that person needs to be in your steering committee. And the reason is that person needs to be aware of what your automations are doing, aware of which systems you're in, aware of what the secured controls, your access rights to those systems are, and will perform a technical audit on your RPA CoE practice. So you need to have the director of your internal audit or one of his representatives that she chooses in your steering committee. And I always made it a practice because I worked in both a Sarbanes-Oxley impacted firm and didn't need to be, but decided to adopt some of those rules, that every automation I've ever done for that process design document passed through internal audit before we started to build. One of the steps, the steps of software development, you gather your business requirements, you do a technical solution, you do your process design document, you submit that document for approval with your process owners or your SMEs, you give that to the developer, and the developer builds that. You develop a testing program, you develop a change control program, and then you go into UAT, functional testing, UAT, and then you deploy to production. Before that PDD, process design document, was signed off, I passed that through internal audit. And yes, sometimes that took an extra time to get it done, but you're just making sure that you've covered all your bases and that internal audit is aware of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and has signed off on that. So always good to have an internal auditor representative on your steering committee. Now, let's talk about external audit. I don't know how many, was it 4 primary external auditors? Was it KPMG, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, and I think there's another one. It's just not coming to my head because I've been talking all day. When you're working with an external auditor, most of those external audit firms, already employ RPA, UiPath RPA in their ecosystem. But you want to become familiar. You want to talk to your internal auditor and say, who is our contact in these outside audit firms? And you want to introduce yourself. introduce the pipeline, kind of a brief summary of the pipeline, not going into any details that would compromise your organization, and say, this is what we're doing. Do you see anything that raises a red flag for you? And when it comes time for your quarterly audit, your semi-annual audit, your 10K, your all the reporting you have to do, that external auditor and you are already familiar with each other, and you've already passing things through that person. So, already talked the internal audit and your technical audits. I think I've gone through 8 technical audits, and a good technical audit is going to be one where, again, they examine your security protocols, they examine your training, they examine your documentation, they examine your role, your controls, they examine your development processes, your standards, things like that, how your CoE is structured, how many developers you have, who's doing what. Your internal technical audit should always be welcomed by your RPA CoE and by you as a developer in that CoE or the manager of that CoE. Because I will tell you, I've only had one finding in my entire time going through technical audits, in all the technical audits I've been through. Limiting roles in ERP system. This is another Sarbanes-Oxley rule, and some organizations add a GRC model into this. Tracking what your bots are doing in the ERP system. Limiting down to as refined as you can the roles and that you're doing in that ERP system, and documenting that this service account is doing this role and this service account is doing this role. Covering your bases, making sure that you've got that documented in your technical design document that you're using when you build. Multi-factor authentication. So when I went to work for GameStop, we had multi-factor authentication on everything. And some organizations now may require that you're familiar with, make you required to use it, where you go to your cell phone, Microsoft Authenticator says, is this the number you see on your screen? If so, push yes, type in the number and say yes. Bots don't have cell phones. We all know that. So you have to work with you, and I think I've mentioned this before in the series, you need to work with your InfoSec, your information security team, and ensure that you have a way that's legal and that doesn't violate, again, if you're a public organization, Sarbanes-Oxley, or any other rules or policies or SOPs the company has, organization has, on multi-factor authentication. At GameStop, we didn't, and they ended up taking that off for the bots. However, it's a process, and a process of review, justification, conversation, meetings, to get that taken off. Credential stores. There was a time when in the cloud, CyberArk did not play with UiPath when UiPath eventually moved from an on-prem model to a cloud model. Now they do. I always recommend using credential stores for credentials instead of just storing them in Orchestrator. Because you as a developer, if they're just stored in Orchestrator, or you have them on a text file saying these are the credentials for this bot for this activity, you then put yourself in a position of risk because you have access to those systems. And the same thing falls under controls. They're not giving access to the system to you, they're giving it to the bot. They realize that for development purposes, we're going into a test environment with maybe data that was refreshed a month ago, or maybe in some instances 3 months ago. But once your automation moves to a production environment, you want to store credentials in a credential store where that password is changed periodically without you knowing what it is, right? Credential stores. All right, let's move on. Public sector clients, controls to consider, FedRAMP. FedRAMP, authorization, standardization, assessment, and monitoring of cloud solutions. UiPath is primarily in the cloud for most organizations. Automation Suite, they're very, even in the public sector, which is what I deal with now, rarely do we see an agency with an on-prem instance of UiPath. The public sector platform was recently approved by the US government, although it only has core RPA, orchestrator, and test suite. Document understanding was subsequently approved in the federal environment and is being added to that platform. That's all there is. In the public sector cloud platform, you have Action Center because you have document understanding. You don't have AI, you have AI Center because you have document understanding, but it's limited to the APIs. You don't have integrations. You don't have apps. You don't have autopilot. It will take another year and a half, the federal government anticipates, for autopilot to be deployed in a public sector environment. Now, in July, they're releasing autopilot in the business platform, so you can play with autopilot. You can start developing automations with natural language processing, things like that. If you're working with the federal government, it's going to be some time. These are highly secured systems. The data is protected, and building an automation in the federal environment is a much different, and I say this from experience, a much different endeavor. So in a commercial environment, private sector environment, I used to be able to build a bot a day, bot every 2 days. I built a bot for the legal department in 4 hours, but I've built over 400, almost 500 automations in my time. In the federal sector, to build 2 bots will take about a year. And the reason it takes about a year to build 2 automations is because every component of that automation is vetted through a federal IT infrastructure and approved, and then goes to another vetting process to be approved. And you could be sitting there for 2 or 3 months with a developed code, a tested product, and not be put into production. So that the federal government's a little bit more strict on what we put into their systems. It's a longer process, and the documentation is entirely different, not just PDDs, roadmaps, run books, technical design documents, change control matrices, UAT testing plans, UAT testing results. The documentation for an automation in the federal government is much different than it would be in a commercial enterprise. And then you have to use government hardware. If you are, in most instances, I can't say in all instances, if you're building automations in the public sector, you're not building them on a private instance of Studio. You're building them on a government laptop that is issued to you after you've passed security clearances that has a government issued license for Studio. So it's a little bit different process for building. All right, let's talk about architecture. Things to consider. Are you using service accounts in your CoE? I would advise to do so, simply because I like the security of a remote server. I don't like having access to a remote server. I know how to do remote servers, and I do know how to do the architecture of a remote server, but I don't like it. I don't like having the ability to build something in a UAT environment and also be the person responsible for branching that off into my Azure DevOps version control or my Git and deploying that into a production branch. I think that should be handled by somebody else, because that gives me the ability to build anything in the entire organization and branch it into my own version control or Git in a production branch. So I like, in my world, to allow IT to assign somebody to do that, because that takes that onus off my back, helps protect my organization, my CoE, helps protect how I do things. Are you using remote servers, or are you going in behind Citrix? Because as you know, when you go behind Citrix, you're picking up images, and you're going to be much more reliant upon computer vision. And if you're not familiar with computer vision, you'll need to learn a little bit more in UiPath about computer vision. Who's doing your server maintenance? I'm going to tell you this how burdensome this was. So at GameStop, they didn't have. At GameStop, I was in the uncomfortable role of moving my own automations, our own automations, the CoE's automations, into the production branch of our Git instance because they didn't have dedicated IT folks to do that. In that same vein, I had recruited an architect, a system architect. His name was JP, to come in and help me spin up the servers, do some server maintenance, patches, and things like that. But JP also did other things for the organization. He was not a full-time person of my CoE. So every Sunday morning, about 11 o'clock in the morning, I had to reboot my servers, clean out the cache. I had some maintenance automations that clean Google Cache and stuff. Empty the temp file, replace that temp file with an empty temp file, I should say, and prepare my servers for another week of work. So I worked every Sunday for about 2 hours doing server maintenance. So in your CoE, you need to understand that you're going to have instances where you're going to have to do server up maintenance. You're going to have to worry about architecture maintenance. You're going to have to worry about patches. I think I told this story again before on another session earlier. Microsoft deploys a security patch once a month, anywhere between the 10th and the 18th of the month. Now, if you're using RPA and you're working in a remote server with a service account, you're going to be challenged to send an email using that service account through Outlook because Outlook doesn't recognize, I should say, the remote server as being assigned to your service account. And once a month, and so you have to go in and change the trust center settings in your Outlook environment. So once a month, Microsoft releases a patch, like I said, anywhere between the 11th and 18th. And if you set that trust center setting to not notify you if someone's trying to send an email on your behalf, that patch for security will automatically change that trust center setting back to the default. So you have to be aware and watch your automations and maybe build logic into your automations if you're using Outlook, for example, or any other email program, or a solution. We'll talk about third-party solutions in a minute. You're going to have to build some sort of logging message, log file, email notification that says, hey, my server can't send an Outlook email. Some sort of try-catch that stops your automation and protects the data that it was processing if that data sat in a queue. And let me go back to working in the public sector real quick, or even in a publicly traded organization where we talk about queues. I'm not going to flip back to the screens because that just gets everybody dizzy. If you're working in a Sarbanes-Oxley environment, even in a public environment, and you're uploading financial information into a queue, you cannot have the same service account that loaded that queue, that same bot that loaded the queue, process that queue. You have to have two different bots. And you can say dispatcher performer, but many of us have used dispatcher performer with the same bot. You have to actually separate those two bots in that server, in that queue. A different bot loads the queue and a different bot processes the queue. All right. Sorry to go off track here, but let's talk about that. All right. Patches. Talked about the Microsoft one. Let's talk about third-party solutions. Or even, let's talk about your servers when it comes to the Microsoft patches we're all aggravated by on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon when your computer system says your organization requires you to restart your computer now, and then you go through this extensive BIOS update that Microsoft or Dell or HP or whatever organization that governs your computers, or even if you're going through a Microsoft update where you're trying to shut down, it says shut down or shut down and restart. You need to have the architect that's setting up your remote servers turn that off. Your remote servers should never, now you can't turn off the security patches, but you should be able to you should have them turn off automatic updating of the actual environment. And then you need to, then that person needs to be the person that says, okay, we need to install this update. When do you want to do it? And you work out a time with them to do it, because you need to turn off all your automations triggers and give them time to go in there. And then you need to go back in and ensure that that update did not impact any of your automations. And sometimes it does, just so you're aware. RPA can be a lot of fun to build, but if you're in a CoE and you're managing this entire process, it can be a little bit more difficult than just building an automation and watching things flow through on your screen. SaaS solutions, third-party solutions that your company contracts with, such as things like Salesforce.com, Lucernix for real estate, Blackline for accounting, things like that. SaaS solution, you have no control, none whatsoever, of when these SaaS solution owners are going to update their systems. None. So you need to make sure you're involved in the SaaS solution release notes. They usually publish this, and let me back up. Not every SaaS solution is going to publish release notes, but you need to make sure that you reach out to that SaaS solution representative or the process owner, because they probably know who they talk to in case that SaaS solution has issues. They probably have the contact in that organization. Let's say Blackline for that matter, because Blackline's popular. If you're a person in your organization, let's say her name's Kara, has run into problems with Blackline, she's going to know who to call within Blackline to solve her issue. You need to make friends with that person too, because you want to get release notes. You want to be notified when they're going to be doing an update to that SaaS solution, because you need to make sure you plan with your businesses that you're going through an update on this solution, and this may impact your automations. So we're going to have to turn those off and retest them in that new solution environment. Okay? And then those release notes can be kind of complicated if you get them, but it's important that you pay attention to those and make sure that you communicate with the people you're building things for. If they're using a SaaS solution, that you let them be aware. We don't control who updates the SaaS solution and when they update the SaaS solution. Another thing you'll recognize about SaaS solutions, third-party solutions. Let's take Blackline again we'll pick on Blackline today. When they start having conferences like UiPath's Forward or anything else, and most large companies that produce software have conferences because it's a way to generate leads and further sales and increase sales. They will start advertising that on the landing page. Hey, join us for this conference. Our conference is here. Here, register by clicking this link. That pop-up disables that front landing page in most instances. So it's going to be difficult for your bot, especially if you're running an unattended bot, to move further into your process because there's a pop-up on that page for one of these upcoming conferences. And what I've learned to deal with this is try catches and emails and messages, and simple email messages saying, hey, I can't get into the landing page for this. And as a developer or a CoE manager, you understand why you can't get into the landing page because it's happened before. So you always want to make sure that you put that in a try catch and then you have someone go in, clear that message, because typically once you clear the message, it doesn't come back. SaaS solutions. Production deployment, I mentioned a little bit of it. I don't like to take that upon myself. I like to give that to other people because that onus is off me. I don't like to play in the production branches, test branches of Git. Yeah, I don't mind doing that, but I don't like playing in a production environment. And you want in your Git or in your Azure version control, you want to be able to compare and be able to see the historical code updates. So typically, what I recommend, and what most people do, but I'm just going to mention it here in case anybody's not familiar. You don't re-promote the entire coded XAML file. You re-promote the things that you change. Again, this is important when you're using reusable code segments. You let them know what you changed and they deploy the changes to your branch only. And that way, when you look at your code, when you're doing code reviews or you're going back and troubleshooting, you can look at the versions of that segment and see what was changed and what was different. All right, citizen developers. This is a great idea, and I remember when UiPath came up with the idea of a bot for everyone. Fill your organization with citizen developers, and I don't know if that's still a push. I haven't heard it a bot for everyone in a long time. Here's the challenge with citizen developers, and it's multifold, especially if you're in a publicly traded organization or working in the public sector. Allowing a citizen developer to build their own automations that run through their assistant on their machine, whether it's in a background picture in a picture, however, or whether they take hands off the keyboard and watch it work. You need some sort of governance over that, and you need some sort of way to service those automations, because some of that, the way Studio X is designed, it's very easy to build an automation for citizen developer. It's low code, drag and drop. There's not most citizen developers, I won't say most, many citizen developers don't know how to invoke Python, or don't know how to write a link expression, or don't know how to write VBDAT in an invoke code. So they're just dragging and dropping, go to this file, read this data, and give me an output. And they don't really realize sometimes, oh, the Excel file changed, so now my automation doesn't work. You need to provide them an avenue to troubleshoot that. This is a burden. I wouldn't say it's an unhappy burden, but it does present a burden upon your CoE, because you are responsible for citizen developers within your CoE. And I have a friend, I think I told you about him last week, when we did this last session last week. He has a CoE that is so expansive, it just boggles my mind. So within his departments, he has I'm trying to remember the term he used, sub CoEs or development hubs or development groups or something. So in his CoE, he has a centralized CoE. Then he has a CoE for some departments have their own CoE. Then within those departments, they have not only citizen developers, they have small development hubs. That structure, to him, it drives him crazy, and it boggles his mind sometimes like it does mine. And he calls me and says, how would I handle this situation? So citizen developers presented an issue, not just because of the maintenance, but tracking and monitoring what their citizen developer may not understand. Well, I'm going to populate my journal entry, then I'm going to validate it, and then I'm going to push the submit button, right? They don't always understand. It's easy for them to understand how to drag and drop code, but they don't necessarily always understand the rules and regulations that they're operating within. And that's your job as a CoE. If a department requests a citizen developer, I make it a rigorous request in my CoEs. I make them justify it. I make them justify the cost, because citizen developer licenses cost money. I make them justify the need. Is this for one automation or two or three or four? They have to answer the why and the how and the who and the who's paying for this, who's going to maintain this, who's going to monitor this, who's going to track this, who's going to measure this. And it got so complicated that Mary Kay, when I was with them, refused to issue citizen developer licenses, because the burden for the CoE there, and it was the IT CoE, not the finance one, the burden for the CoE there was so much that they just couldn't justify being so thin and hiring more IT people to handle the citizen developers, that kind of deal. So citizen developers, that's going to be a challenge. Not, like I said, not an unwelcome challenge, but it can be a challenge. All right. Talked about people. Let's talk about training your staff. And I just have a simple picture here of the UiPath certification levels. And there are more. I think they just changed the vBoard just put out a message that they changed the specialized AI one. They now have an associate specialized AI certification. And not shown here is infrastructure engineer, things like that. There are other certifications out there in UiPath that you can get. I just gave this as a brief slide placeholder. And this is where it gets confusing with scalability. I believe, in my opinion, and you may differ in opinions, but I believe that people in your organization, like I said, that brain power is a part of one of your organizational systems. So I think training your developers to be better at what they do is essential. Now you're going to get some pushback. Like in my COEs, I always required my developers to also become certified business analysts through UiPath. And some developers don't want to do that piece. They don't want to be business analysts and developers. Even though we're requiring it, they don't want to do that. And my argument back to them is, what if I put you on an automation where I don't necessarily have a business analyst for it. It's low hanging fruit. It's a quick win, and I need you to design the PDD. Well, I can do that. Well, that makes you a business analyst. So I always require my developers, once they're done with their associate and advanced, that they go through the business analyst training. It's not difficult. If you've got through associate and advanced development, business analyst professionals can be rather easy for you. I also, if any of my COEs in fact, all of my COEs so far have used document understanding. I always require my people to be certified in specialized AI. And you think this is just cert chasing, Chris, and it's not. I'm making sure my people are educated, intelligent, and capable. Because especially if my COE is going to scale, I need the people to scale that with. Okay. And then if your COE, especially as you grow, is going to, in some organizations, these grow huge, you're going to be faced with the need for solution architects. That's someone that's going to take that solution, know what resources you have, and build that solution out and work with the business analyst to gather requirements and things like that. And being a solution analyst myself as well, I find it interesting. I find that to be one of the most interesting parts of my job, and it could be because I've built almost 500 automations. But I find being a solution architect to be one of the most interesting parts of my job, and it's exciting to me. And in fact, I'm did orals today on one. I'm invited to a new solution architect opportunity tomorrow. I can't stress enough. UiPath is so dynamic, and the technology is changing so often. To keep your staff educated and to gather their certs in a centralized location so you can tout their achievements. You can say, I've got 12 developers that hold 36 different certifications. That sounds good to an organization. That sounds good during reviews. And if you're a consulting agency or you're building for somebody else, that sounds good to win deals. And I think the only thing that I wonder about this particular slide is, should it be here? But I'm leaving it here because I still think people are part of the system, the organizational system. But you also have infrastructure engineers certifications. And you can go on, and if your organization uses a combination of UiPath and Power BI or Power Platform, which and Microsoft and UiPath are partners, you can also get Power Platform certifications, and you can give your organization a much more holistic use of RPA instead of just UiPath. You can give them a much more holistic view of use, and you can tackle more opportunities, grow the COE even further, and make your people nice and happy and your bosses excited because of how much money they're saving. Okay. So for now, I'm going to leave this here. Again, just to warn you, I may say something about it tomorrow, but if you're on that session tomorrow, I may say something then, but I'm going to leave it here. All right. If I'd combined this presentation would have been much longer, but I didn't. So I'm going to leave it there. maybe give you back some minutes. Oh, we're at 3:43. Give you 15 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, me and Dinah can chat for a while. Any questions, anyone? Anyone? Anyone?
I don't see any in chat, but if you guys want to unmute yourself, if you have any questions, please ask them.
Oh, either I put them to sleep, Dinah, or I did a good job.
Good job.
You're always so nice to me. All right, then. It's been a long Monday, I'm sure, for everybody. So I'll give you 15 minutes back. Tomorrow, if you want to join, we're going to talk about scalability, which is important, being flexible and agile. And then I believe Dinah and I are planning another developer series for August, September that I'll hold. That's not going to be CoE centric.
Thank you,
All right.
everybody, for joining today. Thanks, Chris.
No problem.